what happens when a band's greatest achievement becomes the very thing that destroys them? It sounds like the plot of a movie, but for the Los Angeles band Failure, it was all too real. In 1996, they poured everything they had into a sprawling 17-track masterpiece that critics hailed as the future of rock. It was supposed to be the album that made them superstars. But instead, 1 year later, the band was gone. This is a story of how the cult classic album Fantastic Planet killed the band that created it. Before we get started with today's video, if you guys want to support my channel, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button. And I've been told from a lot of my subscribers that they find themselves unsubscribed from my channel, or they don't see my new videos pop up, so make sure you turn on all notifications. And if you guys missed the announcement, I've started a second channel which covers shorter stories. The link to that channel is in the description box below. The early 90s LA music scene was having a bit of an identity crisis. The over-the-top hair metal of the Sunset Strip was being aggressively shoved aside by the raw, angsty grunge movement pouring down from Seattle. The history of the band dates back to 1987 in San Diego, where guitarist and vocalist Ken Andrews and drummer Robert Goss were living. They soon moved to LA around the late 80s, and they were roommates while attending art school together. Andrews picked up music later in life, not playing the guitar until he was age 18, learning it from his brother. He remarked to Spin magazine that the first album he learned to play along to was the Cars' first record. Andrews and Goss discussed putting a band together for quite some time, but it took the pair nearly 2 years to find a bass player. Not helping was that they didn't really feel any connection or affinity for the music scene in Los Angeles, which was dominated by glam metal acts. They ended up putting a classified ad in both the Recycler and Music Connection magazine that read, "Moody Trio seeks fretless bass player. Parallels with early Cure, Bajas, and Joy Division." They eventually dropped the fretless bass requirement in order to cast a bigger net, but despite this, the band only got about 8 to 10 responses, and most of them were not promising enough to even meet in person, let alone jam with. However, one guy did respond to their ad, and it was an Encino native named Greg Edwards. This was around 1989, and Edwards told Bandcamp, "Ken was by far the most serious musician I had met at that point. And more importantly, he was very good at charting practical steps on the way to a goal." With the band having established their full lineup, they soon called themselves Failure. Their drummer Goss already had a few song ideas coming up with them on a 4-track recorder, including the song Pro Catastrophe. The track was the foundation for Failure's lyrics, which always had an element of humorous dark sarcasm in them. The trio soon started playing shows around LA at places like Al's Bar and Club Lingerie, and it was here that they met another local musician, Maynard James Keenan. Maynard shared a similar feeling with the members of Failure about LA's music scene. He wasn't happy with who the local promoters were putting his band on the same bill with, and Tool soon started playing some shows with Failure at places like Club Raji's. Failure, around this time, ended up spending about $800 to press 500 copies of their debut single Pro Catastrophe, and they started mailing them out to college radio stations, and they in fact did get some airplay on local station KXLU. It was this airplay that boosted the audience attendance for Failure shows, going from only a handful of people to 400 to 500 a night. Now, of course, the news traveled to the record label scouts, and by the time Failure played their 19th or 20th show, they nabbed a deal with Slash Records around 1992. While they were an indie outlet, they had some distribution through some major labels. The members initially thought that they might have to change their name, but their label actually liked the name Failure. In 1992, the group released their debut record, Comfort, co-producing the record with legendary producer Steve Albini. In hindsight, they'd called the decision a mistake. They spent about 2 weeks with Albini, and the producer was famous for capturing a band's raw live sound, basically just documenting a performance. But both Andrews and Edwards already had bigger ideas. They wanted a more produced, sonically ambitious sound. They felt too inexperienced to really make Albini's style work for them. But also complicating things was that Goss's writing style was very punk influenced. So Goss and Albini actually got along quite well since they shared a very similar philosophy when it came to the production side. As a result, the band produced and mixed their albums going forward. Failure's sound was hard to categorize as they didn't sound like a lot of the bands from the Pacific Northwest who were popular at the time. Funny enough, Ken Andrews grew up in Seattle but moved away at the age of 12. He told Laddersound, "Our sound was confusing to a lot of people. It was confusing to record labels, it was confusing to the press, it was confusing to a lot of fans. Failure didn't really fit in anywhere. They were heavier than most indie bands, but way too melodic and complex to be lumped in with grunge. Their sound was this intricate mix of heavy guitars, layered textures, and a melodic core. Their dissatisfaction with their first album lit a fire from underneath them when it came time to record their follow-up album, 1994's Magnified. Andrews and Edwards were now living together, and they were literally writing next to one another. But the sessions weren't going smoothly. Their original drummer, Goss, quit, feeling that the band was headed in a direction that he considered unimpressive and too poppy and commercial. As for who played the drums on their second album, they programmed them using a drum machine, and then they brought in a drummer to play the parts. But they initially struggled to find someone to get the sound that they wanted. They didn't tell their label about Goss's departure since they didn't want to freak them out, so Edwards actually ended up playing drums on about half of the album. They ended up recruiting former Dumpster drummer Kelly Scott to round out their lineup when they hit the road to promote the album. Magnified was a huge leap forward. It was heavier, more dynamic, and showed off the band's growing mastery of the studio. Critics definitely noticed, with AllMusic later calling it one of the best records of its kind and the real emergence of Failure. But even with the glowing reviews, Magnified sold about 30,000 copies. A music video for the single Undone got little to no airplay, and they were what you call a band's band, or your favorite band's favorite band. They were deeply respected by their fellow musicians, including tourmates Tool, but mainstream success just wasn't happening. Scott added, Slash was poorly run. Magnified had a lot of fanfare initially. As an alternative rock album, when it didn't sell as well as what they wanted it to, they kind of abandoned it and focused on other things. They would let us tour all we wanted, they just weren't paying attention to the album. To the press and the labels, their unique sound was just confusing, and they were often slapped with the label grunge light or grungedelic, which they both hated. Edwards told Laddersound, "Our heaviness came from early Helmet and classic rock like Led Zeppelin, stuff like that. Grunge exploded between Comfort and Magnified, so we just did what we wanted to do. Going into Fantastic Planet, I think we just wanted to make an epic record. I think Magnified gave us a lot of confidence in terms of our ability to write interesting pop songs and still have a cinematic sensibility." Frustrated but not beaten, they knew their next album had to be the one. It was a make or break moment. With two critically loved but commercially ignored albums, the pressure was on. So the group decided to go all in on their ambition. They wouldn't just produce the next record themselves, they'd completely change how they made it. Instead of writing, rehearsing, and then recording, they'd do it all at once. The first time a song was played, that would be the take. This set them up for a grueling, all-consuming creative marathon stretching to 6 to 7 months. They rented a house in Los Angeles, which, funnily enough, was owned by 80s rock icon Lita Ford, and turned it into their studio and home. They paid about $2,000 a month for rent, and the album was actually recorded for pretty cheap. This house became their crucible, where their masterpiece was forged, and where the band itself would start to crack. Work on what would become Fantastic Planet started in early 1995. The album took its name from a 1973 animated French film about a class struggle between two alien races. The members watched the film during their downtime. In fact, the band credited a lot of the space themes on Fantastic Planet to the movies they were watching at the time. Even as a joke, the band called one of their tracks Another Space Song. Edwards told Laddersound, "I remember driving around near the house and listening to a rough mix of Another Space Song and thinking that alone was what I'd wanted to do with my music my whole life." The album they were building was absolutely epic. Its 17 tracks were a 67-minute journey into alienation, disconnection, and drug addiction. Greg Edwards' lyrics were getting more direct, painting a bleak biographical picture of a life on the edge. Songs like The Nurse Who Loved Me and Smoking Umbrellas were unflinching looks at depression and addiction, while the soundscapes grew more complex and layered. They brought in pianos, twisted guitar sounds, and strange samples to create a sonic world that felt both crushingly heavy and beautifully ethereal. The album was even cynical, with a chiming sound at the end of the final track, Daylight, designed to loop perfectly back to the start of the first track, Saturday Saviour. But as their creative vision came into focus, the band was falling apart. The intense pressure and isolation of recording took a serious toll. Making things even worse was a growing and serious drug problem within the band, most notably involving heroin. Edwards later admitted that by the time they were on tour for the album, the band was in real trouble with drugs, describing a dark period where his life was consumed by it. Edwards looked back at this time recalling, "At the beginning of the process, I fell into an immobilizing depression and felt utterly incapable of rising to the moment and making a record. I chose heroin as my way out of my funk. Fortunately, it worked like a charm and gave me a perspective from which to write lyrics from outer space." Then came the outside problems. Just as they were finishing the record in July of 95, they got the news. Their label Slash Records was being sold and wouldn't be able to release the album. Their masterpiece was done, but it was stuck in legal limbo. For over a year, the album just sat on a shelf. The band tried to shop it around to other labels on the down low, hoping someone would bite. Edwards said by the time the album finally came out, he, and I quote, "wasn't feeling much of anything." During the downtime, the band worked on other projects. Andrews and Edwards started the project The Replicants with former Tool bassist Paul D'Amour to record an interesting collection of cover tunes. Andrews also worked with Molly Maguire and Blinker the Star. Eventually, Warner Brothers Slash's distributor heard the album, loved it, and agreed to put it out on the Slash imprint one last time. Fantastic Planet was finally released on August 13th, 1996. Around the same time, guitarist Troy Van Leeuwen, a friend of Kelly Scott's, joined the band to help pull off the album's complex songs live. Fantastic Planet was met with a wave of critical acclaim, hailed as a groundbreaking piece of work. But commercially, it barely made a ripple. The album didn't chart on the Billboard 200, but its lead single, Stuck on You, became a minor alternative hit, peaking at number 23 on the Modern Rock Tracks chart and number 31 on the Mainstream Rock Tracks chart, and it also got some play on MTV. The record ended up selling about 100,000 copies, but it wasn't the huge breakthrough they desperately needed. With the album out, the band hit the road, a tour that stretched into 1997 and included a spot on that year's Lollapalooza tour where they played on both the main stage and side stage after Korn dropped out. But this tour wasn't a victory lap. It was a brutal final chapter of burnout and decay. The exhaustion from making the record, the disappointment from its sales, and the escalating drug use created the perfect storm of dysfunction. The band was becoming a wreck. For Ken Andrews, the priority was no longer the band's career, it was his friend's life. He later admitted, "My focus was on making sure that he didn't die." He was talking with Edwards' parents, debating an intervention. The creative partnership that had fueled the greatest work was now totally overshadowed by a struggle for survival. In November of 97, with Warner Brothers asking for a fourth album, Andrews made a gut-wrenching choice. He broke up the band. He felt like he had no other option, explaining, "I had to break up the band because everyone else was waiting to see what was going to happen. And I was like, nothing's going to happen. We have to live." After pouring every ounce of themselves into their Magnum Opus, the very act of creating and supporting it had led them directly to ruin. After the breakup, the members of Failure went their separate ways. Ken Andrews became a go-to producer and mixer for bands like Nine Inch Nails and A Perfect Circle, while also starting his own projects. Greg Edwards formed the acclaimed band Autolux, and Kelly Scott became a session drummer for acts like Veruca Salt. For years, Andrews and Edwards didn't even speak, but a strange thing happened while they were gone. Fantastic Planet refused to die. In a time before streaming, the album's legend grew through word of mouth, through internet forums, and through praise from other musicians. It became the definition of a cult classic. Bands like Paramore, Tool, and the Deftones all pointed to Failure as a huge influence. Maynard James Keenan had even admitted that he'd been, and I quote, "ripping those fools off for years." A Perfect Circle famously covered The Nurse Who Loved Me on their 2003 album, 13th Step. The album that couldn't chart had slowly and quietly become one of the most revered rock records of the decade. It was a masterpiece in hiding, just waiting to be discovered. The members themselves stayed apart until around 2004, when Edwards and Andrews ended up reconciling. As a result, the band issued a compilation record called Golden. Their friendship slowly began to mend, a process that was sped up when they both had kids around the same time. The idea of making music again started to bubble up, though at first they thought about a new project, not a Failure reunion. Edwards admitted that for the longest time, the answer to a reunion in his head was, that will never happen. But the ever-growing legacy of Fantastic Planet was impossible to ignore. They started hearing rumors that the band was more popular now than they ever were in the 90s, So the trio decided to test the waters. They booked a single reunion show at the El Rey Theater in Los Angeles for February 13th, 2014. The tickets sold out in under 5 minutes. It was an incredible amount of validation. The night of the show, they looked out at the audience stunned. It wasn't just fans from their generation. It was packed with kids in their teens and 20s singing along to every single word. It was an experience they'd never had in their first run. The success of that one show confirmed what the cult following had been saying all along. Failure's music was more relevant than ever. A full reunion was no longer a question mark. They toured with Tool once again, they launched their own headlining tours, and most importantly, started writing new songs. In 2015, they released The Heart is a Monster, their first album in nearly 19 years. It was a triumphant comeback, picking up right where Fantastic Planet left off, proving that their creative spark between Andrews, Edwards, and Scott was still burning bright. In 2016, Failure announced an October tour where they would be playing Fantastic Planet in its entirety to celebrate the album's 20th anniversary. The band has since put out 2 more records, including 2018's In the Future Your Body Will Be the Furthest Thing from Your Mind and 2021's Wild Type Droid. The story of Failure is a paradox. It's about a band that had to break up to finally find its audience, a masterpiece that had to be ignored to become legendary. Fantastic Planet was the album that killed the band, but it was also the album that guaranteed their immortality. The brutal process and personal turmoil broke them apart, but the art they created in the fire has outlasted it all. It's a testament to a band that was always just a little ahead of its time. The journey of Fantastic Planet from commercial flop to cult phenomenon is a powerful story about timing and legacy. Failure's story is a perfect reminder that a band's end isn't always the end of their story. For Ken Andrews, Greg Edwards, and Kelly Scott, their greatest creative moment led to a painful split, but it also planted the seeds for a future they could never have imagined. The reunion wasn't just all about playing the old hits, it was about finally claiming the success that had slipped through their fingers, a success built on the enduring power of one single fantastic album. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.